The authors of the United States Constitution were very familiar with the history of governments during the Dark Ages. They knew that many governments engaged in nasty tortures and punishments as ways of getting people to confess or to tattle. The kinds of tortures that governments used were most dreadful. Therefore, when it came to starting the United States of America, the founders wanted to make it abundantly clear that no such practices would be allowed by the new government of the United States. And that's what the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution is all about. We're almost finished our study on the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution, known as the Bill of Rights. Now let's learn all about the Eighth Amendment. My name is Dr. Rick Gardner from Columbus State University, and this is a Muskogee County School District podcast. The Eighth Amendment. Okay, let's say you get caught, and maybe you even get found guilty of a crime. What should the government be allowed to do to you as a consequence? Jail? Prison? Execution, maybe? How about torture? Because the founders were so aware of the history of torture since the Middle Ages, they wanted to be certain to prohibit such unhuman activity from ever occurring in the United States. They were particularly aware of the fact that much of the torture that occurred in the Middle Ages was a consequence of religious dissent. An event known as the Inquisition resulted in the torture of many based on their refusal to agree with the religious opinions of the government. The founders of the United States despised such an idea. Therefore, these words were put into the Constitution. No cruel or unusual punishments shall ever be imposed by the United States government. Now, this is the heart of the Eighth Amendment. The biggest problem is that the word cruel is very difficult to define. Isn't putting someone to death cruel? Well, the founding fathers obviously didn't see that because hanging was a penalty that they frequently advocated. Well, isn't putting someone in jail or prison for the rest of their life cruel? That too has never been an acceptable interpretation of the Eighth Amendment. It seems that the main point that the writers of the amendment had in mind was not whether a person is punished or executed, but the way in which they are executed. Since the Eighth Amendment was written, there have been hangings, there have been firing squads, and lethal injections, and all of these have passed the test of the Eighth Amendment. But now a slow or painful execution, such as the way that Giles Corey was squished to death for 2 days after being accused of witchcraft at Salem, is what the founding fathers were trying to avoid with the Eighth Amendment. The Eighth Amendment brings up many important interpretive questions. Here's a few. Number one, is the death penalty itself cruel? Some states have said that it is. Some states have banned executions altogether. If it is not cruel, however, what kinds of executions should be permissible and which ones should be a violation of the Eighth Amendment? How about an electric chair? Some have shown that there is great pain associated with the electric chair, and that's caused a lot of states to simply do away with that method. How about hanging? Although hanging usually results in a quick death, it's a method that routinely fails, causing the victim intense suffering. It's not practiced in the United States the way it used to be. What about decapitation? The guillotine, beheading. That's perhaps the most rapid and effective method of execution, but it also has the most bloody, gruesome, and repellent results to any observer. As a result, it's not in use in the United States. Most of the states that have the death penalty use some form of injection that supposedly just stops the person's heart and other life functions without much visible evidence of pain. Some have argued, however, that the victim of lethal injection does suffer great pain. It's just not seen. Another important question about the Eighth Amendment is whether it should be thought of as applying to all humans or whether it only applies to U.S. citizens. In other words, if a foreign terrorist is captured by the United States government, should the United States be allowed to torture that person since he's not a citizen of the United States? Or should torture simply never be used by the United States government at all? A related question is how to define torture. The United States military has developed a method known as waterboarding. This makes the victim have the dreadful experience of drowning, but in the end, the process leaves no physical damage to the victim. It does, however, sometimes result in the accidental death of the victim. Is waterboarding torture? The Eighth Amendment forbids cruel and unusual punishment. Let's talk for a minute about this word unusual. Occasionally, a judge will give a punishment to a criminal that seems a little odd. For example, in Fort Lupton, Colorado, a man who was found guilty of playing loud music and disturbing the peace was sentenced by a judge to having to listen to loud Barry Manilow music for an hour. Was that an unconstitutional punishment? Was it cruel? Was it unusual? Finally, what about the fact that people prosecuted for crimes are disproportionately black people? In other words, although blacks are only 14% of the population of the United States, they make up 60% of the prison population, and more than half of people who are executed are black. Something just doesn't seem right about this. Certainly, we don't believe that blacks are morally inferior, but if not, why are they more regularly prosecuted for crimes? Something just doesn't add up. It doesn't seem fair. And for this reason alone, some states have done away with the death penalty altogether. Like many of these first 10 amendments, interpreting the Eighth Amendment is a rather difficult task for the Supreme Court and for other courts. It's probably one of the most difficult to interpret. What do you think? What does cruel mean? Do you think that the death penalty violates the Eighth Amendment? We have two more amendments to cover, the Ninth and the 10th Amendments, dealing with the rights of individuals and the states. And that's what our next podcast will address. My name is Dr. Rick Gardner, and this has been a Muskogee County School District podcast.